Welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, 112 elected representatives of the Norwegian people convened at Eidsvoll and wrote a constitution for an independent Norway. This flew in the face of the Treaty of Kiel, signed only 4 months earlier, where the King of Denmark had agreed to hand over Norway to Sweden. A minority of the delegates at Eidsvoll thought that they should all take it easy and hold off on declaring independence and electing a king until they had come to an agreement with the Swedes. But the Constitutional Assembly decided to go ahead and elected Christian Frederick, King of Norway, on May 17, 1814. History was made, and an independent Norwegian kingdom was re-established for the first time in 417 years. Today, we'll see how the Swedish government reacted to the goings-on at Eidsvoll. Would they insist on sticking to the Treaty of Kiel, or would they accept Norwegian independence? Episode 126, War or Peace? Even though the Swedish armed forces were busy wrapping up the fighting against Napoleon on the continent and couldn't interfere to stop the proceedings at Eidsvoll, that didn't mean they were doing nothing. Bernadotte did all he could to secure support from the great powers, so they would back up the Treaty of Kiel, even if the Norwegians would refuse to submit to the Swedes. And in that regard, he was successful. On the same day that Christian Frederick was elected the first king of an independent Norway in over 400 years, the new monarch's jubilant mood was dampened somewhat when he received word that Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria would send representatives to Norway to make sure that the country would comply fully with the Treaty of Kiel, hand over all its fortifications to the Swedes, and enter into a union with Sweden without any fuss. That meant that the great powers expected him, Christian Frederick, to reject the title as King of Norway and pack up and leave for Denmark as soon as possible. Knowing this, Christian Frederick still accepted the Norwegian crown when it was offered to him at Eidsvoll. He did so even though he was told that the Russian Emperor Alexander was rattling his saber and had threatened King Frederick VI that peace between Russia and Denmark would not be restored until Norway was finally handed over to Sweden. Furthermore, Emperor Alexander even hinted that he wouldn't tolerate Christian Frederick on Denmark's throne when he lawfully inherited it if he didn't cut out this Norwegian independence nonsense at once. Still, Christian Frederick pushed ahead. He wasn't going to let himself be bullied by the Tsar. On May 22nd, 2 days after the Constitutional Assembly at Eidsvoll had been dissolved, Christian Frederick entered the Norwegian capital, Christiania. He was greeted by the great and the good of the city, as well as large crowds of regular Norwegians. Ceremonies and celebrations followed each other all day. Cannons shot a salute, 24 young girls spread flowers on the road before him. One of them then handed a wreath of oak leaves with the words, "Deserved honor." This was basically a copy-paste of the ceremonies when a new Danish absolute monarch ascended the throne, and even though many of the locals ate it up with enthusiasm, some of those who recognized the ceremony and its significance were uneasy about what it may mean in terms of the new king's political ambitions. Those who worried weren't exactly calmed by the announcement later that day that Christian Frederick had appointed no fewer than 33 court functionaries. The castle chaplain at Akershus Castle, Klaus Pavels, wrote in his diary, "God knows what we need them all for." Others were more worried that the king would actually find something for them all to do. The excessively large court was unpopular for the political signal it sent, but also for the expense. But Christian Frederick himself seemed unbothered. He settled into his official residence at Bygdøy and worked out a detailed court protocol, setting rules for who was to attend to his person when, at what time the gates were to be opened and closed, how food was to be served, etc., etc. No doubt essential business for the head of state of a country facing an imminent invasion. As he was busy deciding the order of precedence for dinner at his over-dimensioned court, Christian Frederick kept receiving a steady stream of bad news. The great powers all rejected Norwegian independence and his elevation to king. A special envoy from London arrived on June 6th and explained to the king that Britain had every intention of backing Sweden up. In fact, they had already begun. The Norwegian representative in London had been arrested. The grain shipments had been cancelled, even from Denmark, that had been boosting the Norwegian food storages discreetly in the hope that Norway would be able to fight off the Swedish invasion and then eventually rejoin the Union with Denmark. But all that had ended when the Brits had resumed their blockade of Norwegian ports, and Norwegian vessels on the high seas were now hunted and boarded by the British and Swedish navies. As the situation was worsening, King Frederick VI of Denmark sent a message to Christian Frederick asking him to throw in the towel and agree to a union with Sweden, but on the best possible terms for Norway. Also, Christian Frederick's former teacher, who was dying at the time, lingered in the realm of the living to write a letter to his old student from his deathbed. He implored the new king to enter into the negotiations with the Swedes to obtain the best possible settlement for Norway as part of a union with Sweden. Then, he wrote, he'd bless Christian Frederick from his grave. Publicly, the king ignored this advice. He announced that he was mobilizing the Norwegian army and that his people was ready to defend their independence with their lives if need be. They preferred death to the chains of slavery. Orders went out that all men should be conscripted, all reserves called up, and all leaves cancelled. Food, clothes, and money were collected for the war effort. But in private, taking in all the reports and messages, Christian Frederick was coming around to the idea that he needed to negotiate with the Swedes. Sometime between May 17th and the middle of June, he'd lost the will to defend Norwegian independence with his life. He was now prepared to talk terms, something he'd characterized as treason 3 short weeks before. At the end of June, a delegation from Russia, Prussia, and Austria arrived in Christiania. They had the same depressing message as their British colleagues had delivered earlier that month. At an audience with the king, Christian Frederick explained he was willing to abdicate, but first he needed the Swedes to guarantee that there would be no military intervention and no Swedish takeover of Norwegian fortresses. He also suggested that he'd be allowed to stay on as steward or viceroy of Norway, and that he be made crown prince of Sweden. Surely King Carl XIII of Sweden had no use for a French marshal as his heir, now when Napoleon had fallen. This was a non-starter as far as the great powers were concerned. If Christian Frederick would become crown prince of Sweden, he'd eventually end up holding all 3 Scandinavian crowns. That was out of the question. The great powers did not want to establish some Kalmar Union 2.0. They preferred a divided and docile Scandinavia. More specifically, they didn't want one state to be in possession of both shores of the Öresund Strait, controlling trade going in and out of the Baltic Sea. Then, on July 10th, the Swedish government published a proclamation stating that the gathering of the Constitutional Assembly at Eidsvoll had been illegal. As a consequence, the Constitution and all other decisions made by the Assembly were null and void. No room for compromise. The message to Norway was clear: total submission or else. Believe it or not, but this was actually good news for Norway. The representatives from the great powers didn't like the Swedish tone. They were starting to doubt the wisdom of a Swedish hostile takeover of Norway. Instead, they preferred a looser union of 2 separate kingdoms united by 1 king. They thought it would be best for European stability if the Norwegians weren't coerced. Besides, they also didn't like Bernadotte much. They thought him arrogant, not to mention a low-born parvenu. Who was he to act so disrespectfully towards Christian Frederick, a member of one of the most ancient royal families in Europe? A week or so later, the delegates from the great powers left Norway and met with Bernadotte in Uddevalla, north of Gothenburg. He rejected all Christian Frederick's suggestions and told the delegation that their mission was now over. They could go home. But the British representative insisted on one last attempt to avoid war. He got Bernadotte to agree to a compromise, allowing the Norwegians to keep their constitution with minor amendments if they agreed to the union. This meant throwing the aggressive Swedish proclamation of July 10th in the trash, but Bernadotte actually agreed. So the great power delegates went back to Christiania. But now it was Christian Fredrik's turn to say no. He rejected the new proposal because it included a Swedish takeover of Norwegian fortresses. The last attempt to avoid a war had failed. During the early summer months, the Swedes had mobilized 45,000 men along the border, primarily in the south. But it was the Swedish Navy that made the first move, when, on July 26th, it attacked the Norwegians at Hvaler Islands, just north of the border. The attack wasn't exactly a surprise. The Norwegians had been fortifying the islands already at the end of May, since, if there would be a war, the Swedish Navy would have to pass by at some point. Nonetheless, almost as soon as the Swedish attack started, the Norwegian units on the islands were evacuated and the Navy vessels slipped away before the Swedes could make contact. Simultaneously, another Swedish unit, consisting of 6,000 men, landed further north, capturing the Kråkerøy Peninsula, and the following day the town of Fredrikstad surrendered as well. The Swedes were now advancing quickly in the direction of Rakkestad, where the Norwegian main army was located. Everything seemed to be going the Swedish way. But they ran into tougher resistance soon enough. The Swedish plan was for the main attack to come via Fredrikshald, a border town with some 4,000 inhabitants. In peacetime, the people of Fredrikshald had enjoyed a booming trade with their neighbors on the Swedish side of the border, and several roads from various parts of Sweden converged there. It was a strategically vital point for the Swedes to capture if they wanted to invade Norway. There was just one problem. Fredriksten Fortress, perched on a steep 120-meter high hill overlooking the town and all the roads passing by. Anyone who wanted to invade Norway from this direction needed to take Fredriksten first. But it wasn't all that easy. Just ask Karl XII. It was here, trying to capture Fredriksten, that he met his death back in episode 105. On August 1st, the Swedes surrounded the fortress. Bernadotte sent a message to the commander of Fredriksten, Major General Johan Cornelius Åme, to surrender, reminding him that this was a direct order from King Frederick VI. But Åme refused to give up the fortress just like that. If the Swedes wanted it, they would have to take it. Åme was talking a tough game, and Fredriksten was a formidable fortress in an easily defendable position, pointing its 100 artillery pieces at anyone trying to approach. But at the same time, it wasn't really prepared for a siege, and it was running low on gunpowder and food, not to mention morale. 2 days later, on August 3rd, the Swedes sent another demand for surrender. When this too was rebuffed, they opened fire. The Swedes started to bombard the fortress and the town at 5 p.m. And as the civilian inhabitants of Fredrikshald scurried for cover, the fortress cannons fired back at the Swedes. The bombardment continued the following day, the whole day. Fire soon started to spread in town, and the inhabitants struggled to keep the flames under control. On August 4th, the mayor of Fredrikshald asked fortress commander Åme to let the Swedes take the town to spare it further destruction. Åme replied that in that case he'd consider it enemy territory and start firing at the town from above. Then the mayor sent a delegation to the Swedes asking to let the civilians evacuate the town. That request was also rejected. The people of Fredrikshald were stuck in the crossfire from both sides. The relentless bombardment continued for 2 more days, but then the mayor had had enough. He had no other choice than to surrender to the Swedes, which he did. After taking the town, the Swedes sent a third delegation to Åme, increasing the pressure on the commander. They told him he had to surrender, and if the fortress artillery fired a single salvo more, he'd be hanged when the fortress inevitably fell. Åme's response? I'm an old man, and may just as well die soon. Then, in front of the Swedish envoy, he ordered the artillery to open fire again. But Commander Åme's willingness to fight wasn't widely shared at Fredriksten. 21 soldiers deserted, and among the officers, many were in favor of a surrender. It didn't get any better when news came that the Norwegian army was in full retreat. Still, Åme refused to budge, and the stalemate continued. At the same time, some 200 kilometers further north, the Swedes crossed the border from Värmland, advancing towards Kongsvinger with a small force. Here, the two sides had approximately the same number of soldiers. The plan was for the Swedes, commanded by General Karl Pontus Gahn, to advance to the town of Kongsvinger, where yet another Norwegian fortress was located. Gahn wasn't actually expected to capture the town, but to attract as many Norwegian units as possible, thereby weakening the southern section of the front, where the main thrust of the Swedish army was supposed to take place, if they could just get past the Fredriksten fortress. By August 2nd, Gahn and his troops stood approximately 10 kilometers south of Kongsvinger, and here they encountered a fortified Norwegian position at Lier. To begin with, the Norwegian vanguard was pushed back, but when the Swedes emerged from the forest in front of the Norwegian entrenchment, their attack stalled under heavy fire. Gahn kept sending fresh troops at the fortified Norwegian line, but they were thrown back every time. At 9 p.m., they'd been fighting for almost 6 hours, and the Swedes were running low on ammunition. When Norwegian reinforcements also showed up, Gahn finally decided to retreat. The battle at Lier was the first time during the campaign against Norway that the defenders had actually defended themselves, and it had ended with a Swedish defeat. The Norwegians under Lieutenant Colonel Andreas Samuel Krebs had not only stopped the Swedish advance, but also boosted the morale of the Norwegian soldiers. Krebs decided to put pressure on the Swedes and sent a unit of some 1,100 soldiers to cut off their retreat. On August 5th, the two sides clashed again, this time at Matrand, approximately halfway between Lier and the Swedish border. Despite being attacked from two directions, the Swedes eventually managed to break through and continue their retreat. But the price had been high. The fighting on August 5th was the bloodiest in the whole war. Gahn lost 17 officers, 7 non-commissioned officers, and 312 soldiers. The Norwegians suffered 176 casualties. According to tradition, Krebs, clearly inspired by the Greek myth of Theseus, who went off to kill the Minotaur, had promised that if he was victorious, he'd send a messenger back to Kongsvinger on a white horse. But if the Norwegians lost, the horse would be black. In those early days of August, people waited anxiously in Kongsvinger, standing on the walls of the fortress, staring at the horizon, waiting to catch the first glimpse of a rider on a horse, preferably a white one. Fortunately for everyone involved, and unlike Theseus, Krebs remembered to color coordinate his message, and when the people in Kongsvinger finally sighted the white horse approaching, they cheered and wept with joy. At the same time as Krebs was triumphant at the Kongsvinger front, King Christian Frederick ordered troops to Rakkestad on the road between Fredrikshald and Christiania. Early in the morning, August 5th, the general staff was discussing what to do next. The generals wanted to attack the Swedes. They had 6,000 men, and this was the moment to go on the offensive. The Swedes were stuck at Fredriksten, and Krebs was pushing them back across the border in the east. Several members of the government also thought a decisive victory at Rakkestad was necessary to win the war. In the end, the generals managed to get the king to order the army to go on the offensive. But Christian Frederick still felt uneasy about the decision. A victory at Rakkestad would not end the war. The Swedes still had more troops to throw at them. The Swedish soldiers were also better trained, equipped, and fed. In the long run, there was no way Norway could win this war militarily. Christian Frederick was convinced that this whole mess would ultimately be decided at the negotiating table, not the battlefield. And what if they lost a battle at Rakkestad? Then they would have no cards left to play at the negotiations. It would be better to come to the negotiating table with an intact army to back up the Norwegian position. Otherwise, the Swedes would be free to dictate terms to them. So, after a few hours of hesitation and agony, the king cancelled the order, and instead the army was told to withdraw north and cross the river Glomma at Langenes in Askim. There, they built a pontoon bridge, brought over the army, and took up a defensive position in an entrenchment west of the river. The commander of the Norwegian forces at Langenes was Colonel Dietrich Hegerman. You may remember Hegerman from the last episode. He had been a member of the assembly at Eidsvoll, and it was he who suggested compulsory skiing and shooting exercises after church for all Norwegian boys. The weather was horrible as dusk fell on August 8th, and the rain continued to fall throughout the night. The Norwegians knew that the Swedes were advancing northward, and to keep track of their movements in the dark, Hegerman sent out scouts on the eastern side of the river. Because of the weather, which was unseasonably bad even for Norway, a Norwegian scout didn't notice a Swedish vanguard unit until he more or less stumbled across a Swedish soldier. The Swede tried to shoot the scout, but because of the rain, his gunpowder didn't ignite. Instead, they fought it out with bayonets. In the end, the Norwegian scout killed the Swede and took his gun as a trophy. If you're curious to see it, it is still exhibited at the Norwegian Armed Forces Museum in Oslo. Once he knew where they were, Colonel Hegerman decided to surprise the Swedes by attacking them in the rain and the dark. In that pre-dawn attack, the Norwegians managed to drive back the Swedes, who were tired and wet after a night of marching in the rain. But Hegerman didn't want to risk anything, so at dawn, he ordered his men to retreat across the pontoon bridge to take up their defensive positions west of the river. The Swedes pursued them, and as soon as it was light enough, the Swedes attacked across the open field in the direction of the pontoon bridge. Unfortunately for the Swedes, Hegerman had placed a small artillery battery on a low ridge overlooking the field. As the Swedish soldiers slogged across the muddy, waterlogged field, the Norwegian guns were blasting wide gaps in their lines. The attack stalled in the mud, but the Swedes reorganized and made another attempt. It, too, failed. But then the Swedes changed tactics. They regrouped into skirmish formation instead of closed ranks and attacked for a third time that morning. This time, they also used sharpshooters to fire at the Norwegian battery on the ridge, killing several Norwegian artillerists. Still, Colonel Hegerman managed to regroup his cannons, and they pushed the Swedes back for a third time. Around noon, the fighting died down. The Norwegians had stood their ground. The fighting at Langnes could be heard from Christian Frederick's headquarters at a nearby vicarage, and in the morning of August 9th, the king rode out to see how the fighting was going. As he rode past a dead soldier, he cried out, "My God, am I responsible for all this?" To which Colonel Hegerman responded, "We've won, your majesty. Now we shall pursue the enemy." But Christian Frederick was appalled at Hegerman's willingness to spill more blood and instead ordered a retreat, despite the Norwegian victory. He returned to the vicarage and ordered his headquarters to be moved further north. This incident was the last straw for the general staff. They had now lost all their respect for the king, and that evening they got drunk and complained about him so loudly that he must have heard them from his private rooms. They compared Christian Frederick to Christian August, who had been the military commander of Norway during the first years of the Napoleonic Wars, and who later made a short career as Swedish crown prince under the name Karl August. He'd been a skilled military man who had earned and commanded the respect of the army. In other words, he'd been nothing like Christian Frederick. But as cowardly as it may have seemed to the generals, the king's decision actually made sense. Even though the Norwegians had won at Langnes, it was increasingly apparent that they wouldn't be able to win a protracted war. The army was short on supplies, and they only had food for another fortnight. Since the Brits were blockading Norwegian ports, no new supplies or food could be brought into the country. The only way to avoid a disaster in the shape of a defeat was to enter into negotiations with the Swedes. The sooner the better, since they had just won a battle. And the Swedes were actually also interested in a quick end to the war. Already on August 7th, Christian Frederick had received a somewhat surprising offer from Bernadotte. The Swedish crown prince offered a ceasefire if Christian Frederick would relinquish power, but he didn't have to do so to the King of Sweden as previously demanded. Instead, he could give it to the Norwegian government, which would run the country until the Storting was convened. Bernadotte also promised that the Norwegian constitution would be respected, but still demanded that all fortresses should be handed over to the Swedes. This was nothing short of a bombshell. The offer basically scrapped the Treaty of Kiel and the hardline declaration from July 10th. It was both surprising and far-reaching, maybe too far-reaching. Bernadotte hadn't actually run the offer by anyone, not even the king, before he sent it off to Christian Frederick. It's unclear if Karl XIII would have agreed to it. But we'll never know, because Christian Frederick and his government decided to reject this unexpected lifeline. they couldn't allow the Swedes to take over any Norwegian fortresses. So the war had continued. Now, the day after the victory at Langnes, the king moved his headquarters to Moss, where he met a new Swedish negotiator. Bernadotte's demands were the same as before. The negotiations went on for a few days, but they didn't get anywhere, for two main reasons. The first was strategic. Bernadotte still demanded that the Norwegian fortresses be taken over by Swedish troops. The second was more technical. The Swedes demanded that the Norwegian government should rule in the name of King Carl XIII of Sweden until the Storting could be convened. Christian Frederick refused to agree to both these points. But at the same time, he had really lost his appetite for fighting by now. On August 13th, the government urged the king to order an offensive, and Christian Frederick eventually agreed to order an attack on the Swedes, but only 30 minutes later he changed his mind and cancelled the order, calling for yet another retreat instead. Everyone was frustrated. The general staff and the government wanted to fight, and the king, who just wanted the war to end, didn't have it in him to make the last concessions to make it stop. On August 14th, the king and the Swedish envoy resumed their talks. Artillery fire could now be heard in the distance. Christian Frederick jumped at every salvo and protested against negotiating under fire, but the Swedes said there would be no more ceasefires before the end of the war, and if that didn't suit Christian Frederick, the Swedes would break off the negotiations and fight until they achieved victory on the battlefield instead. So the talks continued, and now the two sides finally managed to come to an agreement. Later that day, they signed a ceasefire agreement known as the Convention of Moss. The agreement was signed by Bernadotte on behalf of King Carl XIII and two members of the Norwegian government. The Swedes didn't allow Christian Frederick to sign the convention since they didn't recognize him as King of Norway. Throughout the document, he was consistently called Prince Christian Frederick. Whatever he had been for the last few months, it was clear he would have no role to play in the future running of Norway. Not as Viceroy, not as Steward, and certainly not as Crown Prince of Sweden. In fact, Christian Frederick was to leave Norway as soon as possible. The Swedes agreed to let him stay in the country until a Storting could be convened and release him of his duties. And in a secret addendum, Christian Frederick had to guarantee that he would leave Norway even if the Storting asked him to stay. Until the Storting could get together and make all the necessary decisions, the Norwegian Council of State was to govern the country. But on whose authority? The Swedes had wanted them to run Norway on behalf of Carl XIII of Sweden, since, from their perspective, he'd been the legal king of Norway since the Treaty of Kiel back in January. The Norwegians balked at this idea, and in the end the convention cleverly stated that the council should make its decisions by the highest authority, leaving it vague whose authority that actually was. The question of Swedish deployment in Norway had been a stumbling block throughout the negotiations, but now the Swedes agreed only to take over Fredriksten, close to the border. Sweden was allowed to keep 2 divisions on Norwegian soil, but they weren't allowed to come closer than 30 kilometers from the capital Christiania. In exchange, all Norwegian conscripts were to be sent home. Perhaps most importantly, the blockade of Norwegian ports was to be lifted immediately, allowing for goods and food to enter the country. But the greatest Norwegian achievement in the Convention of Moss was that the Swedes agreed to recognize and uphold the new Norwegian constitution, with a few minor amendments to allow for a union with Sweden. That meant that the Swedes agreed that what had happened at Eidsvoll in the spring was legit, and that Norway could enter into the union as a sovereign kingdom, not a territory to be incorporated into Sweden. The Treaty of Kiel was discreetly binned, as was the belligerent Swedish declaration from July 10th. Once the Convention of Moss was signed by both sides, the campaign against Norway was officially over. But in practice, it would go on for a few more days. Only on August 16th did the news reach Fredriksten that the war was over, and that the fortress was to be taken over by the Swedes. The message arrived just in time to stop the Swedes from trying to take the fortress by storm. They'd received reinforcements the day before and had spent the night preparing for the attack. The following morning, the fortress was handed over to the Swedes, but Commander Ome refused to have anything to do with it. He called in sick, so he wouldn't have to participate in the humiliation. 2 days later, Bernadotte himself arrived in Fredrikshald, but instead of hanging Orme as he had threatened to do during the siege, he now embraced the former commander of the fortress and praised him for his valor during the siege. That's cute, of course, but you could argue that Orme's valor, not to mention the decision to go to war in the first place, wasn't just in vain, but that it also caused the unnecessary death of hundreds of Norwegians, even though everyone with an insight into the state of affairs in the summer of 1814 knew Norway couldn't win the war. But even though the Swedes won the war, you could argue that the Norwegians won the peace negotiations. The fact that the Treaty of Kiel was replaced by the Convention of Moss as the legal basis for the establishment of the Union meant that Norway could remain a nominally independent, separate kingdom instead of just becoming a part of Sweden. The Norwegians got to keep their constitution and their separate institutions, which would make it so much easier, some would even argue inevitable, to achieve full independence later. In this context, it was of the highest importance that the Norwegians had gotten their act together and written a constitution, elected a king, and established a functioning government before the Swedes invaded. But the Norwegians were also lucky that the Swedes wanted to cause as little fuss as possible. They were willing to accept the Eidsvoll constitution if that meant a quick end to the war and as little rancor as possible among the Norwegians for having to give up on independence. Another reason for the Swedish willingness to compromise was that Bernadotte was acutely aware of the diminishing appetite among the great powers to back up the Treaty of Kiel. So he thought it would be best to wrap up the campaign against Norway as quickly as possible, even if it meant letting them keep their constitution. Next time, we'll see how much of a consolation that was to the Norwegians in the fall of 1814. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. I look forward to hearing from you.